Welcome back to My Favourite Things, and following on from a recent video about top 10 favourite children's books, I thought I'd share with you my favourite forgotten or neglected children's authors. Some of you mentioned some of the books I referred to on another video, and that sort of prompted me to think about this. These are authors who are no longer in print, generally speaking. Some are, but really have been sort of passed by and forgotten, and that's such a shame. So without further ado, again going from least favourite to most favourite, but really not very much in between. Here we go. I'd like to start off with Kevin Crossley Holland. This is a book of his called Sea Stranger, Fire Brother and Earth Eater, which is one of his more obscure ones. He's written loads and loads of books. His books still are in print in certain bookshops. You'll find them, particularly with a historical or even a geographical sort of theme to them. Lovely writer, wrote a wonderful novel called Water Lane Angels, and yet never see him in the school library. I'm a school governor, never see them in any of our school libraries. Nobody I know ever reads Kevin Crossley Holland, and yet he remains a really mature, wonderful writer who explores the themes of life, death, birth, purpose and all the rest of it in a really entertaining and beautiful manner. So Kevin Crossley Holland is number 10. Number 9, bit of a cheat really, but I wanted to put him in, and that's Malcolm Saville. This is Strangers at Snow Fell, which I recently wrote an introduction to because it was reprinted by the wonderful Girls Gone By publishers, who I hope you've heard of. They take some of these forgotten authors and sort of renew their books with amazingly good quality introductions and articles. Malcolm Saville wrote the Lone Pine series, the Gillies series, the Buckingham series, Nettleford, Susan and Bill. I've mentioned them in other videos. And he is just a writer of the classic children's adventure stories. And some were stronger than others. Some were more, I suppose, more cerebral than others. Some were more spiritual than others, but always hugely entertaining. This is one of my favourites, Strangers at Snow Fell. It's an adventure on a train that gets stuck in the snow. The descriptions are amazing. The evocation, really, it always reminds me of those black and white documentary films that you see about the night train and such like. It feels like that. Much neglected author, should be more loved, and if you're interested, there is a Malcolm Saville Society which is very active in promoting his work, and he is a wonderful, if neglected, author. Next up is Jane Shaw, and Jane Shaw, perhaps you're wondering what on earth am I doing reading Jane Shaw. It's definitely one of those girls storybook writers from the 50s and 60s. She wrote various series throughout her time. This is my favourite series, and then the name of a place, Adventure, there's Highland Holiday, and so on. Just so witty. I don't often laugh aloud at books, but the characterisation, the jokes, the wit, the contexts that they get into are hilarious. It reminds me a little bit of Anthony Buckridge, who's coming up in a little while, but highly, highly recommended. It doesn't matter whether you're male, female or whatever, this is just pure entertainment. Jane Shaw is grossly underrated and sadly neglected author. Just mentioned Anthony Buckridge, and probably he's the most well-known of all my neglected authors. The Jennings books, this is Take Jennings for instance, which I picked up in an Oxford bookshop for £1.50, it's first edition, and it's in remarkably good condition. Just the fact that you can buy them so cheaply is an indicator of how neglected they are. I found them hilarious. They are stories of an era that will never come again. They're stories of public schools that really can't possibly exist anymore, but maybe they do. They're all about scrapes and japes and a world that you would quite like to have lived in, really. And Jennings is the kind of boy you'd quite like to have had as a friend, and Derbyshire as well, alongside of him. Endlessly entertaining, incredibly inventive. And I have to say, Anthony Buckeridge also wrote a series about a guy called Rex Milligan, which is set in a comprehensive school rather than a public school. And I actually prefer the Rex Milligan books and love those, but there aren't as many of those, and they are much harder to get hold of. But Anthony Buckeridge, much neglected, and if you want cheering up in a pandemic, I can't recommend anything more fitting than a Anthony Buckeridge book to cheer you up. I think one of my favourite children's authors of all time is called Roy Brown, a really ordinary sounding name. He was quite a prolific author. He wrote for the sort of 11, 12-year-olds market, but he also wrote some teenage books, and his teenage books are absolutely electric and brilliant. My favourite of all his books is this one called A Saturday in Putney, which is literally that. It's about what happens one particular day in Putney to a group of basically working class children. His novels are really always about the poorer end of society, about people who live ordinary lives and then have an extraordinary experience. It's brilliantly written, the characterisation is great, full of pathos, and I just don't understand why people don't read him anymore. I would always pick up a Roy Brown book if I wanted a good quality read. Even his slight books, and there's one called The Big Test about a cricket match, which is only about 90 pages long. Even that, which is probably one of his poorer books, is still 10 times better than a lot of the stuff I read that my grandchildren are picking up and buying. Roy Brown. Getting towards the top now. I've mentioned Jill Peyton Walsh before. As an author, I really, really like Gaffer Sampson's Luck was one of my favourite books of all time. This is The Butty Boy, about life on the canals. Her versatility as an author, this is a sort of historical novel. She wrote contemporary novels. She wrote slightly spooky novels. She's written detective novels. She is not a person who writes about one character and then you have this long series and she doesn't vary. Her research must be phenomenal. But she is such a talented author. The Butty Boy, very short, very good. There's a really good book of hers called The Chance Child, which you may have heard of. That is a really, really good book. And I have noticed in my library at the primary school that I'm governor of, one of her books about the Blitz in London is in that library, and that is a really, really good book. I think she is one of the greatest children's authors that Britain has ever produced, and if you haven't read her, can I commend her to you? Strangely enough, Jill Peyton Walsh was married to John Rowe Townsend, who very similarly wrote children's books across a whole wide genre, wrote lots of teenage books which were very powerful and perhaps quite racy at the time they were created, about teenage love in particular and desire. Wrote lots of really exciting children's ones. My own children loved a book called Gumball's Yard by John Rowe Townsend, and it was read year in and year out by them, and now in their 30s my children still read John Rowe Townsend because he is just so good. This is The Intruder, which was made into a totally atmospheric, wonderful TV series which I'd love to see again, but I don't think it's appeared in any shape or form anywhere. Spooky, weird, very unsettling, wonderful descriptions of the coastline in the northwest and the shifting sands. You leave the book wondering, what was it really all about? You want to go back and read it all again. I must have read it at least half a dozen times, and twice in the last few years. This is a great book by a great author who is sadly neglected. He is a literate children's author of the highest quality. Can't recommend him highly enough. I have mentioned before Arthur Catterall, who's a boy's own writer from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even into the 80s he was still writing. Everything he writes is good. It's thrilling, it's page-turning, the characters are realistic and I would say accessible, even at the distance of 70 or 80 years. They're accessible characters. Sometimes he writes about wartime stuff, sometimes about animals and so on. This is The Flying Submarine, which is one of those spy type ones. He wrote, this is I think from about 1930. I just love them. I will read them in a day because they're so unputdownable. I think he got better as he got older, and my favourite book is one I mentioned yesterday in another video about Prisoners in the Snow. But even the last books he wrote, which were shorter and slighter perhaps, are still brilliant books. What a great author, wrote for many years, always good value, hard to find I think in second-hand bookshops, but you could probably find some on eBay. Arthur Catterall, genius. Number 2 in my list is Paul Berna, who was French, and a lot of his novels were translated into English. This is The Secret of the Missing Boat, which I just picked up because if I see a puffin book in a second-hand bookshop of a certain age with a certain logo, I will pick it up and buy it. And I picked this up and bought it and thought, my goodness, this is well written. What a great story, what wonderful characterizations, what clever plotting. And ever since reading this, I've sought out Paul Berna books wherever I've gone. He wrote a book called Flood Warning about a public school which is caught up in a massive sort of flood which devastates the local countryside and traps them in the school. That is just brilliant. He's written books about shipwrecks and so on. Great adventure stories, but above everything else, he crafts characters that are so believable you can almost touch them. This is a really, really nice book. It's not my favourite. I think Flood Warning is my favourite, but this is a nice book. Paul Berna, so difficult to get hold of, so difficult to find, but if you can, you will not regret it. He is number 2. And at number 1, Shoal Stiles. Shoal Stiles, writing again from 40s through to probably late 80s, mid 80s. Writing about a whole range of characters. This is one of his Midshipman Quinn series. He wrote 4 books about a young midshipman in the Napoleonic Wars, very like C.S. Forester's Hornblower, in fact remarkably like Hornblower at times, but vastly entertaining, really witty, clever, inventive, imaginative and so on. But he also wrote some great contemporary books about a family of mountaineers, which starts off with a book called The Shop in the Mountains, which I just absolutely adore. That series is really good. He wrote some adult fiction, again about Napoleonic Wars and that period of history. He wrote a number of later books about sailing, and everything he writes is just brilliant. I'm so glad I discovered him. I collect, for my sins really, books that were published by Red and Green Dragons. Some of you may remember those. They published the Enid Blyton Mystery series, for example. And it was through reading one of those dragon books that I discovered Shoal Stiles, and I'm so glad that I did. Shoal Stiles is my number 1 neglected author. Just an honourable mention of Annabel Farjon here. This is The Siege of Trapp's Mill, which is just one of the most wonderful children's books I've read in recent years. She is related to Eleanor Farjon, again a neglected author, who wrote a book called The Little Book Room, which, if you've never read that, that's an absolute treat and a treasure to read. She also wrote Morning is Broken, the hymn. The Farjons were obviously a very talented family. Didn't quite fit into my top 10 because I've not read enough books by Annabel Farjon to comment, but this one book was really very good, and I commend it to you. So that's my neglected children's authors. In a future video we'll do neglected adult authors, and there might be a little bit of crossover with that one. But thank you for watching, and any comments you've got, stick them in below, and if you want to subscribe and do all that YouTubey stuff, feel free to do so. Thank you.